Rain moved across the English fields, and somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, armed men were already riding. A king was dying. A child was about to inherit a broken crown, and England stood close to choosing another master. In moments like this, history does not feel distant at all. It feels cold, uncertain, and painfully human. I'm Steve Turcotte, and tonight I want to take you into the troubled beginning of Henry III, a king shaped from the start by fear, civil war, and the failures of the father who came before him. Henry of Winchester was born on October 1st, 1207, at Winchester Castle. He was the son of King John of England and Isabella of Angoulême, and from the moment he entered the world, he belonged to a dynasty already under immense strain. His father still wore the crown, but the authority behind that crown had been badly damaged. By the time Henry was born, King John had already lost much of the great continental inheritance that earlier Angevin kings had ruled with pride. Normandy was gone. Anjou was gone. Maine was gone. The vast cross-channel power built by Henry II had begun to collapse. And that loss was not just military or territorial, it wounded the reputation of the monarchy itself. But John's failures abroad were only part of the problem. At home, he had created deep bitterness among his own barons. He demanded money aggressively. He punished enemies harshly. He governed in a way that made many powerful men feel unsafe, dishonored, and cornered. Even in a brutal age, John stood out for the fear and resentment he inspired. Later generations would remember him as one of the worst kings ever to rule England, and that reputation did not come from legend alone. It came from the experience of those who lived under him. In 1215, the crisis erupted. John's barons forced from him a charter that history remembers as Magna Carta. It was not a modern declaration of universal rights. It was a hard political settlement, born from anger, pressure, and mistrust. Still, it mattered. It said, in a very real sense, that the king's will was not without limit. John did not truly accept that limit. Civil war followed. The kingdom divided. Rebel barons looked beyond their own king and invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne. That is one of the most dangerous moments in medieval English history. A reigning king still lived, yet some of his own leading subjects had turned to a foreign prince. The realm was not simply troubled, it was coming apart. Then, in October of 1216, King John died. He did not die in peace. He did not die in triumph. He died with his kingdom fractured, and his son only 9 years old. And so a child inherited not just a crown, but a war, a damaged royal name, and the very real possibility that he might never truly reign at all. There's something starkly unfair in that beginning. Henry had done nothing to create the disasters around him, yet he would spend much of his life living inside the consequences of them. A child in that position needed more than ceremony. He needed protectors. And among those protectors, one figure rises above the rest: William Marshal. If ever a man seemed to stand with one foot in history and the other in legend, it was William Marshal. But the real man was more interesting than the polished heroic image. He had served kings, fought in war, survived shifting courts, and built a reputation for loyalty in a world where loyalty was constantly tested by ambition, fear, and self-interest. He was respected not because he lived in some perfect code of honor, but because he had managed somehow to keep faith in a political world that wore down most men. When John died, there was no time to waste. Prince Louis and his allies held London. Rebel barons were still in the field. The royal government had been badly shaken. In that dangerous interval, Henry had to be crowned quickly. And so, on October 28, 1216, he was crowned at Gloucester. It was not the setting anyone would have chosen under normal circumstances. Westminster was unavailable. London was in hostile hands. The kingdom was too unstable for tradition to take its usual course. But necessity often tells us more about medieval kingship than ceremony does. A crown had to be placed on the boy's head before a foreign prince could claim the same thing for himself. The royal cause also had one great advantage. It had the support of the papacy. Earlier, John had made England a papal fief, acknowledging the overlordship of the Pope in feudal terms. To later minds, that sounds humiliating. At the time, it now became useful. Pope Honorius III had every reason to support the child king against Prince Louis. The church's backing gave Henry something he desperately needed: legitimacy. But legitimacy alone does not stop armies. That work fell to William Marshal. Magna Carta was reissued in Henry's name, and that was a shrewd move. It invited men to return to the royal side. It suggested that the sins of the father would not automatically define the son. That mattered. Men who had fought against John could now imagine serving Henry without feeling they had betrayed everything they had claimed to stand for. Then came the war itself. In 1217, royalist forces under William Marshal won a major victory at Lincoln. It was a decisive moment. Not long afterward, the French cause suffered another blow at sea when reinforcements were defeated off Sandwich. One struggle was fought in mud and steel, the other in wind, sail, and salt water. Together, they changed the balance of the war. Prince Louis, now badly weakened, eventually abandoned his claim and returned to France. England had not merely won a campaign, it had avoided a dynastic rupture. Henry III remained king. I think this early chapter matters so much because it reminds us how fragile monarchy could really be. We often imagine kingship as something solid, something guaranteed by ritual and inheritance, but in practice it could tremble. A dead king, a child heir, a foreign claimant, uncertain loyalties, and a whole realm could tip toward disaster. For Henry, survival came before rule. Before he could govern England, he first had to remain king long enough for people to accept that he was in fact their king. And for that survival, he owed more than anyone to William Marshal. Marshal's experience, authority, and reputation held the crown together during the most dangerous moment of Henry's youth. But even that victory had limits. William Marshal was already an old man. He could save the boy's kingship. He could not stay forever to shape the man the boy would become. And that, I think, is where the deeper tragedy of Henry's story begins. The kingdom had been preserved for him, but not yet stabilized around him. The throne remained his, but the habits of crisis, dependence, and negotiation were already becoming the world in which he would grow up. The men around him had saved the monarchy, yes, but they had also shown him from the very beginning that a king could be protected, guided, managed, and even used by stronger hands. That lesson would not disappear. So when we look at the child Henry standing in the shadow of civil war, crowned in haste while armies still moved across England, we are not just seeing the start of a reign, we are seeing the formation of a kingship shaped by weakness inherited, loyalty borrowed, and danger never very far away. And in the chapters ahead, that fragile beginning will matter more than ever. If ever a man seemed to stand halfway between history and legend, it was William Marshal. But the truth is, the real man was more compelling than the legend ever could be. He had served kings, fought in wars, survived court politics, and built a reputation for loyalty in a world where loyalty was never simple. It had to survive ambition, rivalry, and the constant pressure of violence. When King John died, England had no luxury of time. Prince Louis of France and his allies still held London. Rebel barons were in the field. The royal government had been shaken badly. In that dangerous moment, young Henry had to be crowned quickly, not because conditions were ideal, but because delay itself could have destroyed his claim. So on October 28, 1216, the boy was crowned at Gloucester. It was not the proper setting for a normal royal coronation. Westminster was out of reach, and much of the kingdom was still unstable. But necessity often reveals more about medieval kingship than ceremony does. A crown placed on Henry's head, even under imperfect conditions, was still better than leaving the throne open for a rival. The young king's position was strengthened by the support of the papacy. King John had earlier placed England under papal overlordship in feudal terms, and however humiliating that may sound to later ears, it now worked in Henry's favor. Pope Honorius III had strong reason to support the boy against Prince Louis. That gave Henry something crucial in the medieval world: legitimacy sanctioned by the Church. Still, legitimacy on parchment does not stop armed men. That task fell to William Marshal. Marshal stepped forward as the great defender of the royal cause. He was old by the standards of his time, but he moved with urgency. One of the smartest political acts of this moment was the reissue of Magna Carta in Henry's name. That was not some grand idealistic constitutional gesture in the modern sense. It was also a practical invitation. It told men who had rebelled against John that they might yet return to the side of his son. That mattered deeply. It allowed men to imagine that supporting Henry did not mean embracing the memory of John. Then came the campaigns that saved the crown. In 1217, the Royalists won a major victory at Lincoln. William Marshal helped turn the tide there, and that battle broke the momentum of Louis's supporters on land. Soon after, the naval battle off Sandwich struck another heavy blow. French reinforcements were intercepted at sea, and the entire situation changed. One battle was fought with steel and horseflesh, the other with rigging, wind, and salt water. Together, they made Louis's position in England far weaker. Eventually, Prince Louis gave up his claim and returned to France. England had not simply won a war, it had avoided a dynastic rupture. Young Henry remained king. I think this moment deserves special attention because it reminds us how fragile monarchy could be. We often imagine kingship as something fixed and immovable, wrapped in sacred language and secured by tradition. But in practice, a crown could be terribly vulnerable. A dead king, a child heir, divided nobles, and a foreign prince in London, that was more than enough to push a kingdom toward collapse. For Henry, survival came before rule, and for that survival he owed more than anyone else to William Marshal. Marshal's authority, reputation, and military skill held the royal cause together when it could very easily have fallen apart. But even in victory, there was a limit to what one man could do. William Marshal was already near the end of his life. He died in 1219, and with his death, something more than a man disappeared. A kind of balance disappeared with him. You can almost feel the room change when a figure like that is gone. The old warrior is dead. The candles still burn. The scribes still write. Orders are still issued, but the center of gravity has shifted. Now begins the struggle over who will shape the young king. Henry was still a child, and that meant power naturally gathered around him rather than in him. The question was no longer simply who would defend him, but who would influence him, who would hold him, who would speak in his name, who would guide him toward adulthood or keep him dependent for as long as possible. Hubert de Burgh emerged as one of the most powerful men of the Regency. Peter de Roches, Bishop of Winchester, also remained a major figure. These were not cartoon villains circling a helpless boy. They were serious political men in a hard world, and each had reasons, loyalties, and ambitions of his own. But none of that changes the central truth. Henry grew up in a court where others acted first, and he followed later. That leaves marks on a person. It teaches dependence. It teaches caution. Sometimes it teaches passivity. And those marks would matter, because the kingdom that had been saved for him in war was now entering a different kind of struggle. Not the open danger of invasion, but the slower and more complicated struggle over influence, law, kingship, and trust. Henry had survived his childhood. The crown was still his, but the deeper question remained unresolved. What kind of king would he become after growing up in a world where so many others had ruled around him, over him, and in his name? When William Marshal died in the year 1219, England lost more than a regent.
It lost the one man whose reputation and authority had steadied the kingdom through its most dangerous moment. And once he was gone, the balance that had held the young king's world together began to shift. You can almost feel the atmosphere change. The old warrior is no longer there. The candles still burn in the halls, clerks still write, messengers still arrive with sealed letters. But now the real struggle begins, not over whether Henry will remain king, but over who will shape the king he becomes. Henry was still a child, and that meant power naturally gathered around him rather than inside him. Men did not just compete for offices, they competed for access, for influence, for the right to stand near the young king and guide his decisions before he was truly capable of making them alone. Hubert de Burgh became one of the dominant figures of this period. Peter de Rochus, Bishop of Winchester, was also deeply important. These men were not simple villains circling a helpless child. They were political actors in a hard and unstable world, each with his own interests, loyalties, and ideas about how the realm ought to be governed. But whatever their motives, the central truth remains the same. Henry grew up in a court where others exercised power in his name long before he could fully exercise it himself. In 1220, Henry had a second coronation at Westminster. This time, the setting was proper, the ritual fuller, and the symbolism far stronger. That mattered. In the medieval world, kingship was not only legal, it was visual, sacred, and public. A king had to be seen in the right place, under the right blessings, connected by ceremony to the line of rulers who came before him. The rushed coronation at Gloucester had saved his claim. The second coronation at Westminster gave that claim dignity. Around the same time, Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest were reissued again. These documents did not yet carry the almost sacred constitutional meaning they would gain in later centuries, but even now they were becoming central to the way royal government worked. In 1220, when Magna Carta was reissued in exchange for taxation, something important became clearer. The king could not simply demand what he wanted as if the disasters of John's reign had never happened. England was still a feudal kingdom. It was not democratic, it was not modern, but it was becoming a political society in which kingship had to negotiate. And Henry would grow into adulthood under those conditions. That is one reason his reign is so compelling. He was not just a man with certain personal weaknesses, he was also a ruler formed by a political world that had already shifted beneath him before he was old enough to understand it. His mother, Isabella of Angoulême, had returned to the continent in 1217, leaving him behind. To modernize, that can feel like abandonment, and perhaps emotionally for the child, it may have felt that way. But we should be careful. Royal children in the Middle Ages were often raised within wider households and under supervision away from their parents. That was not unusual. Still, even if the arrangement was not extraordinary by medieval standards, the result was the same. Henry grew up without the steady presence of a parent whose first concern was simply him. Instead, he was surrounded by men whose loyalty to the crown might be real, but whose interests were never only personal or protective. William Marshal had probably come closest to serving as a true guardian. After his death, the atmosphere became less secure and more political. Disagreements among the leading men intensified. Peter de Rochus eventually left on pilgrimage, Cardinal Pandulf withdrew as well, and in time, Hubert de Burgh emerged as the principal figure around the king. Under Hubert, Henry slowly began to assume more visible royal duties. He was taught about the work of kingship. He was introduced to the functions of government. He even took control of the Great Seal while still in his teens. That was an important step. The seal was not just an object, it was authority made visible. Through it, royal will became action. And yet, even here, Henry's growth was shaped by guidance rather than independence. He was learning kingship, yes, but he was learning it in an environment where others still set the terms. Meanwhile, the wider political and military world was still changing. Though John had lost much of the old Angevin inheritance in France, the English crown still held certain territories across the Channel. Gascony remained especially important, and the French crown, now under Louis VIII, continued pressing against what remained of English influence on the continent. Plans were made to send Henry's brother Richard to Gascony, but military effort required money, and money always brought England back to the same political nerve: taxation. The memory of King John's financial demands remained strong. Barons did not forget that easily. So, in 1220, taxation was granted only in return for the formal reissue of Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. This was not a minor detail. It showed that royal government increasingly had to operate through consent and exchange. The crown wanted resources, the political community wanted guarantees. And in that arrangement, we can see something of Henry's reign taking shape before Henry himself truly takes command. I think this is where the past becomes especially human. We often want kings to step into adulthood fully formed, as if maturity arrives the moment the crown settles properly on the head. But that is not how people work. Henry had grown up in instability. He had learned obedience before command, dependence before mastery. He had watched stronger men manage crises while he stood at the center of them without controlling them. That kind of childhood leaves traces. By the later years of the Regency, Henry had also become increasingly influenced by the Church and by Archbishop Stephen Langton. Hubert de Burgh remained important, but he was no longer the only force shaping the king. Henry's piety was becoming clearer, and so too was his openness to guidance from those he trusted. Again, that sounds harmless at first. A devout king was not necessarily a bad thing in the 13th century. In many ways, it was admirable. But piety joined to uncertain judgment can leave a ruler vulnerable. A king who seeks moral direction is not the same as a king who commands with clarity. And clarity, more than anything else, is what Henry would need. Because by the time he moved closer to adulthood, he was inheriting not a blank slate, but a kingdom already trained to negotiate with the crown, already wary of royal overreach, already shaped by charters, councils, and the memory of civil war. That is why Henry's early reign matters so much. It is not merely the story of a child king surviving danger. It is the story of how a king was formed by structures he did not create, expectations he did not choose, and powerful men who stood between him and authority at every step. By the end of these Regency years, England had not collapsed. In that sense, the system had worked. The kingdom was more stable than it had been in the final years of King John. The French threat had receded, government functioned, the charters had been confirmed. But the deeper question remained. Had England successfully raised a king? Or had it simply taught Henry to live surrounded by stronger wills, more experienced hands, and a political world in which the crown itself had to ask permission more often than it commanded? That question would follow him into manhood. And once Henry began ruling more fully in his own right, the habits formed in these early years, the dependence, the piety, the need for counsel, the uncertainty beneath the surface, would begin to show more clearly than ever before.
When Henry III finally began to rule more fully in his own name, he did not step into power with a clear and confident inheritance. What he inherited, more than anything else, was memory. The memory of his father's failures, the memory of civil war, the memory of barons rising against a king they no longer trusted. And all of that shaped the way Henry's kingship would be judged. That burden mattered. Henry was not starting from neutral ground. He was trying to be king in a realm that had already learned to be suspicious of kings. In the year 1236, Henry married Eleanor of Provence. On the surface, this was a royal marriage of exactly the kind medieval politics depended on. She was young, well-connected, and her family brought valuable continental ties.
But marriages between ruling houses never came alone. They brought relatives, expectations, advisors, patronage networks, and rivalries. And Eleanor's arrival did exactly that. Her family connections, especially those linked to Savoy, soon became deeply influential at the English court. Men connected to her household and wider kinship network gained positions, honors, and access to the king. Some were capable, some were simply resented. In truth, many were probably both, but in a medieval court, resentment could be as politically important as competence. The issue was not only that these men were foreigners. Medieval England was no stranger to foreign-born elites. The deeper issue was favor. Who had the king's ear? Who gained offices? Who received lands, titles, and opportunities? Every royal court creates winners and losers, and those who lose seldom accept it quietly. Henry, perhaps without fully grasping the long-term effect, allowed his court to become increasingly shaped by these outside networks. That fed baronial discontent. It reinforced the old fear that the king could be influenced too easily by men whose roots and loyalties did not lie in the kingdom itself. At the same time, Henry remained drawn to ambitions overseas. The lost continental lands still haunted the Plantagenet monarchy. His father had failed to recover them, and Henry was tempted by the same dream of restoration. That is one of the recurring patterns of his reign. He often looked toward prestige, symbolism, and distant possibility when the harder, more immediate work of governing England was still unfinished. In 1242, he launched a campaign in Poitou. This mattered enormously, because it tested not just Henry's military judgment, but his political standing at home. The expedition did not go well. It was expensive, it failed to restore royal glory, and when Henry returned to England, he brought back not victory, but a damaged reputation. That kind of failure can be fatal to a king's authority. A ruler does not need to win every campaign. Medieval kings lost wars often enough, but he cannot repeatedly give the impression that he does not understand the scale of what he is risking. And Henry too often seemed to mistake aspiration for ability. If John had been feared and hated, Henry risked becoming something different. He risked becoming a king who was not taken seriously enough. That may sound less dramatic than tyranny, but in practice it could be just as dangerous. By the later 1240s, another source of tension entered even more forcefully into Henry's world. The Lusignans, his half-brothers through his mother's second marriage. Their arrival intensified the already dangerous politics of favoritism. Many English barons believed these men enjoyed power out of proportion to their merit and behaved arrogantly under royal protection. Historians differ in how they explain the anger directed toward them. Some emphasize baronial jealousy and hostility toward foreigners. Others focus more on genuine abuses, heavy-handed behavior, and the breakdown of trust in local government. Most likely, both forces were at work. Political resentment and real grievance often live side by side. And once again, the crucial problem was Henry himself. He wanted loyalty, he wanted reverence, he wanted space to act as king. But time and again he placed confidence in people who made that loyalty harder to sustain. He protected them when he should have judged more carefully. And a king can survive defeat or debt more easily than he can survive the growing belief that he does not see what is happening around him. That was the atmosphere in which Simon de Montfort rose to extraordinary prominence. Simon did not begin as a simple champion of liberty, and we should be careful not to turn him into that. He was ambitious, forceful, and deeply capable. He could be difficult, and he could also be brilliant. He was one of those dangerous figures history produces from time to time, a man convinced of his own gifts and increasingly convinced that he had a cause worthy of them. He came from a powerful continental family. His father made a fierce name for himself in the Albigensian Crusade. The younger Simon came to England to pursue his claim to the earldom of Leicester, and in time he secured it. He entered royal circles. Eventually he married Henry's sister Eleanor. For a period, he and the king were close. That relationship is important because Simon was not always Henry's enemy. Their connection began in favor, not rebellion. But closeness at medieval courts could become bitterness with astonishing speed. Simon had served the crown, including in Gascony. He had quarreled with Henry. He had been exiled and restored. Their relationship carried all the instability one expects from a political world built on pride, patronage, and wounded trust. By the later 1250s, the kingdom was drifting to a serious crisis. The king's finances were strained. His judgment was under increasing criticism. His foreign relatives remained deeply unpopular. And then came the Sicilian project, one of the clearest signs of how far Henry could be drawn by grand dreams. With papal encouragement, Henry accepted the idea that his younger son, Edmund, might become king of Sicily. It sounded magnificent. It sounded dynastic. It sounded like the kind of project that flatters a royal imagination. But it also required vast sums of money and implied military commitments England did not want. To many of Henry's barons, it looked less like policy and more like fantasy. In 1258, the crisis broke openly. Armed barons confronted the king at Westminster. Out of that confrontation came the Provisions of Oxford. A council was established to oversee reform and to limit the king's freedom of action. Offices were to be supervised, governance was to be monitored, Parliament was to meet more regularly. We should not romanticize this as democracy. It was not. It was baronial reform led by magnates defending their place within the political order. But it still mattered enormously. It imposed organized restraint on the crown and gave institutional form to years of frustration. Simon de Montfort became one of the leading figures in that movement, not always the only one, and not always uncontested, but certainly one of the strongest. He had military credibility, noble rank, family ties to the royal house, and a gift for embodying opposition to Henry's increasingly mistrusted style of rule. And this is where the moral tension of the story deepens. What does honor mean in a kingdom like this? Is it obedience to an anointed king, even when that king rules badly and shields the wrong men? Or is it resistance in the name of the realm, even when resistance leads towards civil war? Medieval people asked those questions in different language than we would, but they felt their weight very clearly. Henry defended kingship, but often managed it poorly. Simon defended reform, but also advanced his own power through confrontation and force. Neither side stood on perfectly clean ground. That is one reason Henry's reign is so compelling. It resists simple judgment. He was not his father. England could be thankful for that. He was more pious, more humane in some respects, and less openly vicious. But neither was he the kind of commanding king his circumstances demanded. He too often seemed surrounded by stronger personalities, drawn towards appearances of grandeur, and unready to recognize which dangers truly mattered. By the end of this phase of his life, the kingdom was no longer simply uneasy, it was divided between two visions of rule. One still looked to the sanctity and dignity of kingship. The other insisted that a king who ruled badly could not simply be left to his own will. Henry stood at the center of that struggle. But more and more, it was Simon de Montfort who seemed ready to seize the direction of events. And once men begin to enter royal halls armed, speaking the language of reform with swords at their sides, compromise becomes much harder to preserve.
Simon de Montfort did not step into English history as a simple hero of liberty, and I think it is important to begin there. That version is too neat, too modern, and far too forgiving. The real Simon was ambitious, forceful, and often difficult. He could be magnetic, even brilliant, and like many gifted political figures, he was dangerous precisely because he believed so strongly in himself, and increasingly in the justice of his cause. He came from a powerful continental family. His father, also Simon de Montfort, had made a fearsome name in the Albigensian Crusade. The younger Simon crossed to England to press his claim to the earldom of Leicester, and in time he succeeded. That success brought him into the orbit of the English crown, and before long he became more than just another nobleman. He married Henry III's sister, Eleanor, and that tied him directly to the royal family. For a time, Simon and Henry were genuinely close. That is worth remembering,
because the conflict between them did not begin in simple hostility. Like so many medieval political relationships, it moved through favor, usefulness, suspicion, insult, dependence, and rivalry. Simon served the king. He helped in royal business. He even governed in Gascony, though not gently. The local population there came to hate his severity, and his rule left a hard impression. But even that harshness could look useful to a king who needed forceful men in difficult places. And yet, closeness at court can be one of the quickest roads to bitterness. Simon quarreled with Henry. At times he fell from favor. At times he returned. Their relationship was never stable for long. Each man needed the other at different moments, but neither fully trusted the other. And in that unstable bond, we can already see the seeds of the larger crisis to come. By the 1250s, the kingdom was under growing strain. Henry's finances were poor. His judgment was being questioned more openly. His tendency to reward foreign relatives remained deeply unpopular. And then came one of the clearest examples of his political miscalculation, the Sicilian project. With papal encouragement, Henry accepted the idea that his younger son Edmund might be made king of Sicily. On paper, it sounded magnificent. It was the sort of project that glitters at court. It promised prestige, dynastic glory, and a broader role in European politics. But beneath the surface, it was reckless. It required money on a vast scale, and military effort far beyond what England was prepared to provide. To many of Henry's barons, it looked less like policy than fantasy. And this is where I think the character of Henry comes into very sharp focus. He was not incapable of feeling deeply. He was not without conviction. But he often mistook grandeur for strength. He reached for what sounded impressive, while neglecting what was practical, immediate, and politically necessary. In calmer times, a king might survive that sort of tendency. In Henry's England, he could not. In 1258, the pressure finally burst into open confrontation. Armed barons entered Westminster and forced the king to submit to reform. From that crisis came the Provisions of Oxford. A council was created to oversee government and limit the king's freedom of action. Major offices would be supervised. Governance would no longer proceed simply as Henry wished. Parliament would meet more frequently. We should be careful here. This was not democracy in any modern sense. It was baronial reform, driven by magnates defending their place in the political order and trying to restrain a king they no longer trusted. But for all that, it was still a major turning point. Organized limitations were now being placed on royal power in a way that could not easily be dismissed as temporary irritation. Simon de Montfort rose to the front of this movement. He was not always the only leader, and certainly not everyone supported him for the same reasons, but he had the right combination of noble status, military credibility, royal family connection, and force of personality. He could speak in the language of reform, while also projecting the confidence of a man willing to seize events and shape them. That combination made him powerful. And here we come to one of the moral questions that runs all through this period. What is honor in a kingdom like this? Is it obedience to an anointed king, even when that king governs poorly? Or is it resistance in defense of the realm, even when resistance pushes the kingdom towards civil war? Medieval people did not frame the question exactly as we might today, but they felt its force all the same. Henry defended kingship, but too often exercised it poorly. Simon defended reform, but did so with ambition and coercion. Neither side stood on entirely clean ground. That matters because history is often too eager to hand us heroes and villains, but the truth is usually rougher than that. Simon was not a pure constitutional visionary descending into a dark age to teach liberty, nor was Henry merely a helpless victim of wicked subjects. These were men of rank, pride, belief, and limitation, all moving inside a political world that had already been damaged by distrust. And once armed men begin speaking the language of necessity, compromise becomes much harder to sustain. Henry had been humiliated by the Oxford settlement. He was still king in name, but his freedom to govern had been sharply reduced. Simon, meanwhile, had become one of the most formidable men in England. Yet even in triumph, he faced the same danger that follows all reformers who rise through pressure and force, the temptation to become the very thing they claim to oppose. That danger had not yet fully unfolded, but it was already there. I think this is where the old romantic image of the medieval knight breaks apart most clearly. We like to imagine men of this age as creatures of honor, living by bright codes and clear loyalties. But the real men were more complicated. They were shaped by family, debt, fear, opportunity, anger, piety, and ambition. Honor was real, yes, but it was rarely pure. Often it was mixed with self-interest. Often it was claimed most loudly by men whose hands were already dirty. Simon de Montfort understood how to gather resentment and shape it into political force. Henry, by contrast, too often gave that resentment fresh material. He protected favorites. He pursued expensive dreams. He failed to reassure those whose support he most needed. And by doing so, he steadily widened the space in which Simon could act. By the end of this stage of the story, England was no longer merely troubled. It had moved into a new and more dangerous phase. The king had been constrained. A reforming faction had institutional form. Simon had become the leading face of opposition, and the realm was beginning to ask more openly than before what kind of kingship it could tolerate after trust had been broken. That is why the provisions of Oxford matter so much. Not because they solved England's problems, they did not, but because they showed that a king could be forced into a system of oversight by his own political community. That was an extraordinary thing. For Henry, it was a humiliation. For Simon, it was an ascent. But for England, it was only the beginning of another struggle. Because once a king has been limited by force, the next question is unavoidable. Can he ever truly forgive those who did it? And can those who have tasted power through reform ever be satisfied with anything less than control? That answer was still ahead, but by now the kingdom was moving toward it with gathering speed.
For a brief moment, it looked as if Henry III might recover his authority without plunging the kingdom into full disaster, but that moment did not last. The years after the provisions of Oxford were marked by reversals, shifting loyalties, and repeated struggles over who truly governed England. Prince Edward, Henry's eldest son, moved uncertainly between factions before gradually drifting back toward his father. That uncertainty matters, because Edward was being formed in the harshest political school imaginable. He was watching the crown restrained, barons armed, and the kingdom governed by men who spoke in the language of reform while competing for power among themselves. Those years hardened him. Henry, meanwhile, had not accepted humiliation quietly. In the year 1261, he secured a papal bull annulling the provisions of Oxford. With that backing from Rome, he moved to reclaim power. Castles and offices began to return to royal hands. Some opposition weakened. Simon de Montfort withdrew for a time. It was a genuine recovery, and for a while it may even have seemed that the king would simply outlast the reform movement. But Henry had a gift for wasting his own opportunities. Instead of using that moment to restore trust at home, he drifted once again toward prestige abroad. He traveled to France. He involved himself in diplomatic display and foreign concerns, while tensions in England remained unresolved. The Welsh frontier was still unstable. Baronial anger had not disappeared, yet Henry seemed drawn, once more, toward the world of ceremony, dynastic status, and continental image. This is one of the reasons his reign can feel almost tragic. Not tragic because he was a great man struck down by fate, but tragic because he so often failed to understand what his own kingship required. He was not incapable of acting decisively. He could be stubborn, he could be devout, he could be sincere, but he repeatedly mistook appearances of authority for actual security. That distinction mattered more and more. Henry loved the sacred image of kingship. He invested heavily in Westminster. He revered Edward the Confessor. He seems to have believed deeply in monarchy, not just as power, but as something sanctified. There is something moving in that, but there is also danger in it. Sacred kingship may steady the soul of a ruler, but it cannot replace practical political judgment.
and judgment was exactly what the moment required. In 1263, Simon de Montfort returned to England as disorder deepened. His movement revived, castles were seized, London once again became a center of opposition. The kingdom was slipping back toward confrontation, and all the old questions returned with even greater force. Could Henry rule without limitation? Could the barons force reform and still claim loyalty? Could the kingdom survive another armed struggle over what kingship meant? An attempt was made to settle matters through arbitration. Louis IX of France, one of the most respected rulers in Europe, was asked to judge between king and barons. At Amiens in early 1264, Louis ruled firmly in Henry's favor. He rejected the provisions of Oxford and upheld royal authority. On paper, this should have been a great victory for Henry. He had the judgment of a king admired for holiness and discipline. He had legal and moral support. But the opposition, led by Simon, refused to accept the decision. And once that happened, words were nearly exhausted. The kingdom was moving toward war again. I think this is where politics begins to change its smell. Before this point, we are in chambers, councils, abbeys, and halls. We are listening to arguments over charters and authority. But once arbitration fails, all of that gives way to something more immediate. Mud, horse sweat, iron, breath trapped inside helmets, the fear before impact. That is the point at which constitutional language becomes battlefield reality. The Second Barons' War had begun. In May of 1264, the opposing armies met near Lewes. When I picture medieval battle, I do not first imagine grand formations seen from high above. I imagine fragments, the scrape of mail over leather, the tightening of reins, banner cloth made heavy by damp air, men hearing mass at dawn and wondering whether they would be alive by dusk. Battles do not arrive to those inside them as clean historical episodes. They arrive as noise, confusion, hope, terror, and sudden violence. Edward fought with great aggression. At first, that seemed to serve the royal cause. He struck hard and drove off part of the enemy line. But he pushed too far. He pursued too long, and in doing so, he lost the cohesion that mattered most on a medieval battlefield. Simon, by contrast, held the field with more discipline. The royal army was defeated. Henry was taken. So was Edward. The consequences were extraordinary. A reigning king of England was now effectively in the hands of his enemies. Yet Simon did not depose him. That would have gone too far for many people, even after all that had happened. Medieval politics still depended heavily on legitimacy, and legitimacy clung stubbornly to the anointed king. So Henry remained king in name, but only in name. He was visible, present, and politically necessary, yet no longer free. Edward's captivity mattered just as much. The heir to the throne had become a hostage to the new political order Simon was trying to shape, and that order, for a time, seemed remarkably strong. Simon governed in the king's name. In January of 1265, he summoned a parliament that later generations would remember with great interest, because it included not only magnates and clergy, but also knights from the shires and representatives from boroughs. Historians are right to be careful here. This was not the birth of modern democracy. Simon was acting from need as much as vision. He needed wider support. He needed broader legitimacy. Still, the gathering remains an important moment in the longer history of Parliament. Yet Simon's position was never as secure as it appeared. The same problem that had weakened Henry began in another form to threaten Simon. Power attracts expectation. Allies want reward. Family wants advancement. Lands become bargaining tools. And gradually accusations grew that Simon was enriching himself and his house under the cover of reform. This matters because it cuts to the heart of the whole conflict. Men had risen against Henry for favoritism, misrule, and untrustworthy governance. If Simon now looked as though he was building his own household power in much the same spirit, then the moral force of reform began to erode. This, to me, is one of the clearest places where the distance between legend and history becomes impossible to ignore. The knight in romance acts for honor alone. The lord in real history almost never can. He acts for kin, for safety, for revenge, for memory, for opportunity, for belief, and yes, sometimes for principle. But principle does not erase the rest, it mixes with it. Simon de Montfort was no exception. As support around him began to fray, one particularly important ally drifted away, Gilbert de Clare. That defection mattered, and then something happened that changed the entire balance of the war. Prince Edward escaped captivity. His escape in 1265 transformed the struggle. Once Edward was free, the royalist cause had not only a royal figurehead, but a leader who had learned from defeat and was now becoming far more formidable. He moved quickly, he gathered support, he struck hard. He was no longer just Henry's son, he was becoming something his father had often failed to be, a decisive commander. Simon still held Henry, he still had forces in the field, but now he faced an enemy who had both royal blood and military momentum. That was a dangerous combination, and from that point onward, the campaign tightened. Rivers, roads, castles, and timing began to matter as much as open battle. Simon needed to unite his forces. Edward needed to prevent that. The war was no longer simply about charters and councils. It was moving toward a final military reckoning. Henry had regained some authority, lost it again, and watched his kingdom pass through repeated cycles of humiliation and recovery. But now the center of gravity was shifting toward Edward. The father still wore the crown. The son was becoming the arm that might save it. The struggle was not over. In some ways, it was now only entering its most dangerous phase. Because once Edward was free, the question was no longer whether the royal cause had life left in it. The question was whether Simon de Montfort could survive, the prince who had been sharpened by captivity, civil war, and the sight of his father's crown held hostage by others.
In May of 1264, the armies met near Lewes. When I think about medieval battles, I never picture them as neat shapes on a map. I think of them in fragments. The scrape of mail against leather, the sound of breathing caught high in the throat just before impact, banner cloth hanging heavy in cold, damp air, the smell of horses, churned mud, sweat, and fear. We call these moments battles as if they were single, coherent events, but for the men inside them, they must have come as noise, confusion, and sudden terror. Not history, not strategy, not legend, just the desperate effort to stay alive for one more minute. On the royal side stood King Henry III and his son, Prince Edward. Opposing them was Simon de Montfort, the rebel leader who had become the center of a movement that claimed to be fighting for reform, restraint, and the good of the realm. At first, the battle seemed to swing toward the king's side. Edward fought fiercely, with the kind of energy that could break an enemy line through sheer force. He drove part of Simon's army back and chased them hard. But that success became a mistake. He pursued too far, too fast, and in doing so, he lost control of the larger battle. The royal army's cohesion began to collapse. Simon, meanwhile, held his position more carefully. He kept command of the field while Edward was drawn away, and when the moment came, the royal forces were defeated. The outcome was astonishing. King Henry fell into Simon's hands, so did Prince Edward, and that changed everything. England now had a reigning king who was, in effect, the prisoner of his enemies. Simon did not formally remove Henry from the throne. That would have gone too far for many people, even those unhappy with the king. In the medieval world, legitimacy mattered deeply, and legitimacy clung stubbornly to an anointed ruler. A king crowned by God's grace could be resisted, corrected, even controlled, but openly replacing him was another matter entirely. So Henry remained king in name. He was still visible, still present, still part of the political structure, but he was no longer free. He had become a captive sovereign, a man whose authority survived in form while slipping away in substance. Edward's captivity mattered just as much. He was not only the king's son, he was the heir, the future of the royal line, and now he too had become a hostage to the political order Simon was trying to create. In the months that followed, Simon ruled in the king's name, and in January of 1265 he summoned a parliament that later generations would remember with special interest. It included not only magnates and churchmen, but also knights from the shires and representatives from the boroughs.
That gathering has often been treated as a great turning point, and in some ways it was. But historians are right to be cautious. This was not the simple birth of modern democracy. Simon was not building a system that would look familiar to us now. He was doing something more immediate and more practical. He needed support. He needed legitimacy that reached beyond his own faction. He needed to widen the base beneath him, because power taken by force is rarely secure unless it can also persuade. Still, the moment mattered. Even if it was born from necessity, it became part of the long and complicated story of Parliament in England. But Simon's position was more fragile than it appeared. Like Henry before him, he began to face accusations of favoritism, self-interest, and hypocrisy. Lands were redistributed, allies expected rewards, supporters wanted payment for loyalty, and critics claimed that Simon was using the language of reform to strengthen his own family and enrich his own circle. Those accusations were not entirely false. They rarely are. Men who seize power in the name of principle often discover that principle must live alongside patronage, military pressure, family ambition, old grudges, and political necessity. And that is where legend and history part company. The knight of legend acts for honor alone. The lord in history almost never can. He acts for survival, for kin, for memory, for debt, for fear, for ambition, and sometimes, yes, for conviction. What makes him real is not purity, but mixture. Slowly, support for Simon began to fray. One of his most important allies, Gilbert de Clare, turned away from him. That was a serious blow, and then came the event that changed the entire balance of power. Prince Edward escaped captivity in 1265. That escape transformed the war. Once Edward was free, the royalist cause regained more than a commander. It regained momentum, confidence, and purpose. He moved quickly, gathering men, rebuilding alliances, and striking with increasing force. He was no longer just the king's son, no longer merely a prince caught in his father's failures. He was becoming something sharper, harder, more dangerous. The wars that had trapped Henry were shaping Edward into a very different kind of ruler. Simon still had King Henry with him. He still had soldiers. He still had a cause, at least in part. But the ground beneath him was shifting, and now he was being pursued by a prince who had already learned one hard lesson at Lewes, the cost of losing control, and who had no intention of making the same mistake again. The struggle was no longer simply about reform, or rebellion, or the authority of a weak king. It was becoming a contest for survival, and this time Simon de Montfort was the one being hunted.
The campaign that led to Evesham feels, even now, like a cord being pulled tighter and tighter. By this stage, the war had become a struggle not just of open battle, but of movement, timing, and control. Simon de Montfort was trying to join forces with his son, who was also named Simon. That link mattered enormously. In medieval warfare, an army cut off from its allies could be destroyed before the real contest even began. If two forces failed to unite at the right moment, the larger cause could collapse with them. Prince Edward understood that perfectly. He had already learned the cost of losing control at Lewes. This time he moved with much greater discipline and speed. He was determined to stop the elder Simon from linking up with the younger Simon and any other support that might still be gathered around him. So the campaign became a matter of roads, crossings, rivers, and strong points. There was maneuver along the Severn, and suddenly bridges, castles, and narrow routes became matters of life and death. This is one of the truths about medieval war that often disappears beneath the romance of banners and cavalry charges. Battles may capture the imagination, but armies have to march before they fight. They have to find food, choose routes, protect supply, read the land, and guess the enemy's intentions. Very often, the march decides the battle long before swords are drawn. Edward moved aggressively through that landscape. He struck at the forces of Simon the Younger near Kenilworth and captured their banners.
It might seem like a small detail at first, but it would become one of the most important moments in the campaign. Meanwhile, Simon de Montfort the Elder was moving with King Henry still in his company. He was making for Evesham, believing that help might be near, or at least that he still had a chance to unite with friendly forces before Edward could close the trap completely. But the trap was already tightening. On the morning of August the 4th, 1265, in rain and deepening dread, Simon saw banners approaching. For a moment there may have been hope, relief perhaps, reinforcements, rescue. And then came recognition. They were not the banners of his allies. They were his own banners, captured by Edward and now turned against him. That is one of those moments when history suddenly becomes intimate. It is no longer about charters, reforms, or political programs. It becomes the instant a man realizes with terrible clarity that he has been deceived, surrounded, and trapped. Evesham itself offered Simon very little hope. The town lay in a bend of the River Avon, and that geography mattered. His force was smaller, his room to maneuver was limited, escape routes were narrow and uncertain. Edward and the Royalists held the advantage in position, in initiative, and in confidence. Simon seems to have understood the danger fully. Historians cannot always verify every dramatic phrase later put into his mouth, but the meaning of the moment is clear enough. He knew this was no ordinary engagement. He knew he was riding toward disaster. And then the battle began. Evesham was not remembered as a noble contest between worthy opponents. It was remembered as a slaughter. The memory of Lewis was still fresh among the Royalists, and they came into this battle with anger already burning. There was very little mercy to be found that day. The fighting was hard, fast, and brutal. Metal crashed against metal in the rain. Horses screamed. Mud and blood mixed underfoot. Men slipped, struck, shouted, and died in close and desperate violence. Whatever language of chivalry men liked to use in calmer times, much of it broke apart at Evesham under the pressure of vengeance. This was not the elegant warfare of romance. It was civil war in its rawest form, intimate, bitter, and merciless. Simon de Montfort was killed in the fighting, and even death did not end the rage against him. His body was mutilated afterwards, not simply as proof of victory, but as an expression of hatred. That detail matters because it tells us something about the emotional temperature of the war. Simon was not treated merely as a defeated enemy, he was treated as a man many believed had broken the natural order of the kingdom. Several of his followers were cut down without the kind of restraint that high-born captives might once have hoped for. Under other circumstances, noble prisoners could expect ransom, negotiation, or at least a measure of protection based on rank. At Evesham, that older expectation gave way to something darker. Revenge mattered more than custom. King Henry himself was in danger during the fighting. According to the sources, he reportedly had to identify himself to avoid being killed by his own side in the chaos. If that account is true, and there is strong reason to think some version of it is, then it gives us one of the most striking images in the whole war. An anointed king, carried so deep into the storm of civil conflict that he nearly dies unrecognized in the violence of his own rescue. At Evesham, Henry was restored, and Simon was destroyed. But restoration is not the same as healing. The battle ended Simon de Montfort's rule, but it did not instantly mend the kingdom he had fought to reshape. The war was not entirely over. Resistance lingered, grievances remained. The wounds left by rebellion, captivity, vengeance, and bloodshed would not disappear in a single victory. Henry had his throne back in more than name now. The great rebel who had once governed through him was gone. The prince who had escaped captivity had become the decisive force in the realm, and yet the kingdom that emerged from Evesham was still bruised, frightened, and divided. What remained to be seen was whether victory would teach Henry wisdom, or merely make him harder.
After Evesham, Henry had a chance to calm the kingdom. He had won back control. Simon de Montfort was dead. The rebellion had been broken at its center, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the crown might choose restraint, that victory might be followed by reconciliation.
But that is not what happened, at least not at first. The defeated were punished harshly. Lands were confiscated. Rebel families paid the price. Widows, children, and heirs felt the consequences not just in grief, but in law, in property, and in survival. Estates were lost. Incomes vanished. Futures that once seemed secure could collapse almost overnight. By medieval standards, this was not unusual. Victory often came with penalties, and rebellion was never treated lightly. But politically, it was dangerous. When men believe that surrender will cost them everything, they are far less likely to lay down their arms. Fear hardens resistance. Desperation extends wars. And so, the fighting did not simply end with Evesham. Resistance continued, most notably at Kenilworth. The great castle became a symbol of unfinished conflict, a place that stood for the fact that the kingdom had won its decisive battle, but not yet its peace. That distinction mattered. Military victory can break an army. It does not always restore a realm. In time, necessity began to force a more practical approach. The crown could not go on ruling a damaged country through punishment alone. So, in 1266, came the Dictum of Kenilworth, an attempt at settlement that offered former rebels a path back. In many cases, they could recover their lands by paying fines, with the amount often scaled to their level of involvement in the rebellion. That was not forgiveness in any modern sense. It was not mercy without cost, but it was a way forward, a way to rebuild, a way to draw men back into political life rather than leaving them permanently outside it, bitter and dangerous. The dictum did not erase the memory of the war, but it made coexistence possible for many who had once fought against the king. And then, in 1267, came the Statute of Marlborough. This mattered for a different reason. It brought into law important parts of earlier reform and addressed long-standing grievances in governance, landholding, and local abuses of power. Some of its provisions would remain part of English law for centuries. In fact, parts of it endure even now. That matters because it reminds us of something easy to miss. Even in an age marked by personal weakness, factional struggle, broken trust, and outright civil war, medieval politics could still produce lasting legal change. Out of crisis, something durable could emerge. And that may be one of the strangest truths about Henry's reign. He was often not the master of events. More than once he was pushed by forces around him, corrected, constrained, pressured, and at moments nearly displaced. He did not dominate his age in the way some kings did. He did not bend the realm smoothly to his will. Very often it was the other way around. The realm forced itself upon him. And yet, the period through which he lived helped shape the long development of English political life. Magna Carta, first issued in the reign of his father and then reissued during Henry's minority and later in his adult rule, gained a firmer place in political culture during these years. Parliament, still changing, still limited, still far from anything we would call modern, became more deeply rooted in the workings of the kingdom. Statutory government also grew in importance. The language of law, consent, and custom became harder to ignore. Now, I do not think Henry planned all this with some grand constitutional vision. The evidence does not support such a flattering picture. He was not quietly designing the future. Much of what happened in his reign came through pressure, resistance, compromise, and crisis. Reform often emerged not because Henry led it, but because he could not entirely prevent it. But history is not always made by those who understand where it is going. Sometimes it is shaped by people who are simply forced to endure it. And that gives Henry's story a moral complexity worth keeping. He could be generous, he could be deeply devout, he could also be stubborn, inattentive, and vindictive. Simon de Montfort could speak in the language of reform and yet rule in ways that served his own power and family interest. William Marshal had preserved the crown when Henry was a child, but even the greatest guardian could not determine what sort of man that child would become. And King John, hated, mistrusted, feared, cast a shadow that never fully left the reign of his son. So what does honor mean in a story like this? It is not spotless. It is not the clear, shining virtue of romance. More often, it is a claim made by compromised people living through compromised times. Some speak of honor sincerely. Some use it as a weapon. Most carry both motives at once, whether they admit it or not. By the end of the 1260s, Prince Edward had become the strongest figure in the royal family. The wars that had damaged his father had sharpened him. He had shown energy, discipline, and force where Henry had so often shown hesitation. In 1270, Edward took the cross and left on crusade, carrying his ambitions outward while England remained behind him. Henry, now aging and increasingly frail, stayed in England. The final chapter of his life was quieter than the years of rebellion and battle, but it was not simple. The kingdom endured, though not unchanged. The scars of civil war remained beneath the surface. Westminster arose in grandeur around the memory Henry hoped to leave behind, shaped by his piety, his taste, and his longing for permanence. And the old king, who had spent so much of his reign being carried by events he could not fully command, moved slowly toward his end.
Henry III died at Westminster on November 16, 1272, after a reign of 56 years. It was an extraordinarily long reign by medieval standards, and when you look at the shape of it, there is something almost haunting in the contrast. It began in civil war, in uncertainty, in the shadow of a hated father and a threatened crown, and it ended in age, fatigue, prayer, and the stone silence of a royal abbey that Henry had spent much of his life transforming. If you visit Westminster and stand beneath the great spaces shaped during his reign, you can still sense something of his mind there. Henry was drawn to the sacred theater of kingship. He admired Edward the Confessor with deep sincerity, almost with reverence. He poured immense wealth into the abbey, not simply because he was devout, though he certainly was, but because he wanted to bind monarchy, sanctity, and memory into one lasting place. And in that he succeeded. Westminster became one of the great ceremonial hearts of the English crown. It was a statement in stone, a vision of kingship made visible, solemn, holy, continuous, and larger than any one troubled reign. But buildings remember differently than chronicles do. Stone can preserve ambition, it can preserve taste, it can preserve devotion, but chroniclers preserve character, failure, contradiction, and resentment. And the chroniclers leave us with a more difficult Henry. Yes, he was devout. Yes, he could be generous. Yes, there were times when he seemed personally kind, even gentle. But he also appears again and again as politically uncertain, too easily influenced, too dependent on stronger personalities, and too often unable to match the force of the man around him. He was not his father, and England may well have been grateful for that. He did not carry King John's particular blend of suspicion, cruelty, and destructive energy, but neither was he the commanding ruler his circumstances demanded. He lived through an age that required strength, judgment, and steadiness in unusual measure, and too often Henry did not have enough of any of the three. And still, I think we should be careful before dismissing him too easily. He inherited a poisoned legacy. King John left behind not only political damage, but a deep fracture in trust between crown and realm. Henry came to the throne as a child, at a moment when the monarchy itself was under immediate threat. This was not a stable inheritance. It was a crisis handed to a boy. And boys who become kings are rarely shaped in simple ways. Before Henry could stand independently, he had already been formed by regents, counselors, churchmen, household influences, ambitious favorites, and competing factions. His crown was preserved by William Marshal, whose loyalty and brilliance saved the royal cause at its weakest point. But even William Marshal could not fully protect Henry from the habits of dependence that were born in those vulnerable early years. That matters because it helps explain the man Henry became. He was never shaped by secure authority. He was shaped by rescue, by guidance, by correction, and by the constant presence of stronger hands around him. A king raised that way may wear the crown, but he does not always grow easily into command. Later, Simon de Montfort would expose Henry's weaknesses in dramatic and public fashion, but Simon also exposed something larger than one man's failure. He brought into the open the kingdom's deeper argument about power, consent, and law. How should a king rule? What limits, if any, should bind him? What did the political community owe the crown, and what did the crown owe in return? Those questions did not begin with Simon, and they did not end with him, but during Henry's reign they became impossible to ignore. And that is why this reign matters so much. It is not only the story of one imperfect king, it is the story of a medieval realm trying, painfully and often violently, to decide what kingship could be after trust had been broken. It is the story of a political culture learning through conflict that authority might need to be negotiated as well as obeyed. You can see that in the legal traditions strengthened under pressure during Henry's lifetime. You can see it in the continued life of Magna Carta. You can see it in the emerging role of Parliament, still far from modern, still limited, but becoming harder to exclude from the structure of rule. You can see it in the memory of civil war itself, where noble ideals and brutal realities met on the same muddy ground. And perhaps you can see it most clearly in the four men at the center of this story. King John, feared and resented, whose failures poisoned what came after him. William Marshall, loyal, capable, and impressive beyond almost any standard, but mortal like all men, unable to guarantee what would happen once his guiding hand was gone. Simon de Montfort, visionary to some, dangerous usurper to others, a man who spoke in the language of reform while becoming entangled in the same self-interest and harsh necessity that shapes so much of political life. And then Henry III himself, the king who outlived them all, endured them all, and was changed by every one of them. That may be the clearest way to understand him. Not as a hero, not as a villain, not as a mere pause between greater names, but a king who endured. A man carried by crisis, preserved by loyalty, challenged by rebellion, and remembered in stone, in law, and in the long aftershocks of struggle. History does not always give us heroes. More often it gives us people who are weaker, prouder, more frightened, more devout, or more compromised than legend would comfortably allow. But to me, that is where the past becomes worth listening to. Not in perfection, in truth. I'm Steve Turcotte, and if you've come this far with me, then you already know that Henry III was never simply a footnote between greater names.